Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to look at how to analyze genotype with a test cross. If you haven't watched it yet, I recommend pausing this one and checking out the video on monohybrid crosses before you continue. Now, before we get into the mechanics of a test cross, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to our test subjects for this experiment. And I'd like you to take a moment to jot down between 3 and 5 observations that you can make about these mice. Your observations don't need to be deep or profound, just anything that you can see. And feel free to pause the video if you need some time. Got some? It might be something like they have ears or they have 4 paws, but hopefully you also noticed that one has gray fur and one has white. Keeping your prior observations in mind, do you think you can determine the mouse's genetic makeup from what you can observe? Got an answer? Hopefully you went with "in some cases." And if you didn't, then I hope that the rest of this video will help to explain why that's the case. Let's quickly recap some of the important information we looked at in the monohybrid cross video about dominant and recessive alleles. Remember that genotype, genetic makeup, controls phenotype, physical appearance, in that we can only observe a recessive phenotype in homozygous recessive individuals. If there are either 1 or 2 dominant alleles, the dominant phenotype will be shown. In the entirely hypothetical example that we're using here, let's call the gene for fur color gene G, since gray is dominant to white. This means that being either homozygous dominant or heterozygous for G will result in gray fur, while only being homozygous recessive will result in white fur. This is why we said that we can tell the genotype by the phenotype in some cases. In the case of a recessive phenotype, we know what the genotype is. But in the case of a dominant phenotype, it could be either one. What if we had an individual with a dominant phenotype and we needed to know the genotype? How would we figure it out? Well, we could cross them with a homozygous recessive individual and look at the phenotypes in the offspring. In our first scenario, let's consider what would happen if the gray mouse was homozygous dominant. As we did in the monohybrid cross, we'll separate out the parent's alleles into potential gametes and put them in the Punnett square. The alleles get combined to give us the potential genotypes of the offspring. Now, based on this outcome, what percentage of the offspring do you think would have gray fur? Got a number? Hopefully you answered 100%. We know they would all have gray fur because they would all be heterozygous, just like the F1 hybrids from a monohybrid cross. But let's consider the second scenario, where the gray mouse is heterozygous. Again, we can separate the alleles and put them into the Punnett square, resulting in these potential genotypes in the offspring. So, what percentage of the offspring from this cross do you think would have gray fur? In this case, it would be 50%. Those with a dominant allele will have gray fur, while those with 2 recessive alleles will have white fur. Now, as with the monohybrid cross, it's worth remembering that these numbers are statistical probabilities, not defined exact outcomes. Now, especially with small sample sizes, may not be exactly 50%. But we can say for certain that if any of the offspring have the recessive phenotype, the mystery parent must have been heterozygous, since the only way for the recessive phenotype to appear is to have inherited a recessive allele from each parent. With all that information in mind, here's a practice scenario for you to test cross yourself. Let's assume that you cross a single white male mouse, and we'll call him Mouse M, with 2 different female gray mice, who we'll call Mouse X and Mouse Y. A mouse X has a litter of 6 gray babies, while mouse Y has a litter of 5 gray and 2 white babies. Now, based on this information, what do you think are the genotypes of X and Y? Now, feel free to pause the video if you need some time to work on it. Got your answer? Hopefully, you selected number 1. Mouse X is homozygous dominant, and mouse Y is heterozygous. Now, since this is a small sample size, it is possible that X is heterozygous, but it is statistically unlikely that all 6 of them got the dominant allele and skipped the recessive one simultaneously. We can be absolutely certain about mouse Y, though. The appearance of the white fur in the babies tells us that mouse Y has to have a recessive allele, and so mouse Y must be heterozygous. Thanks for watching, and please be sure to check out the other videos on Mendelian inheritance.